Howdy, everyone. Hope you had a good day today, or you're having a good day whenever you watch this. This is part four of the series um, on the truth about psychiatry. Um, on the last video, we ended up with mention of Dr. Thomas Saz, but we were also reviewing Robert Whitaker's book, um, The Anatomy or Anatomy of an Epidemic. I also mentioned Robert Whitaker's book, Psychiatry Under the Influence, Institutional Corruption, Social Injury, and Prescription for Reform. Um, I'm not going to go too deep into this book, but it's an excellent book that um, Whitaker he exposes more fully the financial interests behind psychiatry. That's why he calls it Psychiatry Under the Influence. Basically, all the financial incentives that are pushing the marketing of drugs and the expansion of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and the promotion of so-called mental illness in order to market more drugs, in order to acquire more patients. Basically, Whitaker argues that psychiatry is a corrupt institution. Um, he's careful to note that there are good people who are psychiatrists or who work in the mental health field, but he compares that to good apples in a rotten barrel. So he wants to make sure to, and he's trying to persuade both sides of the spectrum here, because he works with a lot of people who are influential in the field of mental health and in psychiatry. So he's trying to persuade them to look a little more closely at the actual history of psychiatry, and also the connections with pharmaceutical companies and the profit motive. So this is an excellent book, Robert Whitaker's Psychiatry Under the Influence. I highly recommend it. I recommend all of his books, Mad in America, Anatomy of an Epidemic, Psychiatry Under the Influence. He has two others, but I haven't read those. He also has a website, as I mentioned, Mad in America, madinamerica.com, um, and many of the authors that we'll discuss in these videos either publish on Mad in America or they are frequently referenced on Mad in America. So if you're interested in this topic and you frequent that website, you'll become more familiar with these authors. I do want to talk about Thomas Saz's book, one of his groundbreaking books, The Myth of Mental Illness. Maybe we'll get to that at the end of this video, and maybe go delve into it more deeply in the next session. And I forgot to give a name to this particular video. The first video was Cracked, named after this book here. The second video was Mad in America, named after Robert Whitaker's groundbreaking history of psychiatry in America and the abuse and torture of the so-called mentally ill in America. And then we talked about Anatomy of an Epidemic back here last time. So let's see, Cracked, Secret of NIM, Anatomy of an Epidemic. This one, I have so many books around and so many ideas that I want to share that I'm maybe having a little trouble coming up with an overarching theme. Maybe some of the things we'll talk about in this video include the Ethan Waters book, Crazy Like Us, and these are all authors that Robert Whitaker mentions in his books. So Ethan Waters, there's mention of Edward Shorter, There's mention of Irving Kirch, um, and more dismantling of the chemical imbalance myth, or the hoax that I like to call it. Also, there's mention in Whitaker mentions Peter Breggin. I'd like to review a couple of his books for you. He has many books, and he publishes frequently on Mad in America. Very insightful. He's also like Thomas Saz. He's a psychiatrist, and uh, Anne Blake Tracy, Bonnie Burstow, Peter Gotcha. So these are some authors that I'd like to introduce you to if you haven't heard of them before, if you haven't read their books. The overarching theme is building up to the theme of the myth of mental illness, uh, which is the title of an essay that Thomas Saz wrote in the 60s. And it's also the title of his book. Um, so maybe this we'll keep this video under the title Psychiatry Under the Influence, since that's the title of Whitaker's book, and these other books, these other authors that he mentioned, kind of help to understand, bring under that same rubric of why psychiatry is under the influence, and what that influence is. So that's Whitaker's book, Psychiatry Under the Influence. Um, and as I mentioned, Whitaker has many references in his books to a guy named Ethan Waters. He wrote a book called Crazy Like Us, the globalization of the American psyche. This is such a fascinating book. I really enjoy it. As with all of these books, there are things that I don't agree with, but there are just many insights that are very thought provoking, and whether or not you're interested in the topic of psychiatry or mental illness, it's just maybe helpful to know some of the things that are going on in this supposed field of medicine. Um, so, what is this book? Crazy Like Us. I mean, as the title suggests, Ethan Waters is exploring how the United States, or more specifically psychiatry and the mental health profession, has managed to market madness, or market ways of thinking about so-called mental illness to various regions of the world. So there's several chapters in here that are, that treat different countries. For example, Chapter 1, The Rise of Anorexia in Hong Kong. Chapter 2, The Wave That Brought PTSD to Sri Lanka. Chapter 3, The Shifting Mask of Schizophrenia in Zanzibar. Chapter 4, The Mega Marketing of Depression in Japan. That's a fascinating chapter. And conclusion, The Global Economic Crisis and Future of Mental Illness. So this is a very insightful book. This is basically, Waters is showing that in different countries and different cultures, people think about suffering in different ways. And the United States, or more specifically psychiatry and pharmaceutical companies, have tried to weasel their way into different countries to promote the American way, or I would separate American from American psychiatric. So the American psychiatric way of thinking about suffering, mental, emotional, spiritual suffering. So let me just share a few passages from this book that I think are relevant to our overall discussion of psychiatry under the influence. He's asking what motivates us in this global effort to convince the world to think like us. But the simple answer that Ethan Waters gives is drug company profits. These quote these multi-billion-dollar conglomerates have an incentive to promote universal disease categories because they can make fortunes selling the drugs that purport to cure these illnesses. Um, so that's part of his underlying thesis for this book. Um, but there's just so many great insights in here. He does quote Edward Shorter. I mentioned Edward Shorter as he's a medical historian or a historian of psychiatry. And I mentioned that there's a lot, I've read Shorter's History of Psychiatry, and it's very skewed, and there's a lot of problems with it, which is, it's written in a very, it's written more as a, how would you call it? Apologetic of psychiatry than it is an actual history or um, an accurate representation of what psychiatry is. But Shorter does have some useful insights that Waters also mentions in his book. Let's see if I can find them here. So one of the things that Shorter noticed was, and Waters quotes here. This is what Waters has to say about it. As his body of research shows, as his Shorter's, history was full of ever-changing psychosomatic symptoms, shaped in large part by the expectations and beliefs of the current medical establishment. And this is Shorter's now, quote, as doctors' own ideas about what constitutes real disease change from time to time due to theory and practice, the symptoms that patients present will change as well. These medical changes give the story of psychosomatic illness its dynamic, the medical shaping of symptoms. So this is a really interesting concept that medical theory and practice is actually shaping how we think about disease and how we think about even quote unquote mental illness. And I would say that even prior to medical theory and practice, you have actual philosophy and theory and practice that I think precedes even that. So they're shaping, ideas matter. They're ideas that are shaping other ideas, including ideas in the field of medicine and how they manifest themselves in the medical world. Shorter has some useful reflections on that. Here's another. Let's see. This is Waters just paraphrasing Shorter. People at a given moment in history in need of expressing their psychological suffering have a limited number of symptoms to choose from, a quote-unquote symptom pool, as he calls it. When someone unconsciously latches on to a behavior in the symptom pool, he or she is doing so for a very specific reason. The person is taking troubling emotions and internal conflicts that are often indistinct or frustratingly beyond expression and distilling them into a symptom or behavior that is a culturally recognized signal of suffering. And this is a direct quote. Patients unconsciously of Shorter, patients unconsciously endeavor to produce symptoms that will correspond to the medical diagnostics of the time. And then Waters goes on to say, because the patient is unconsciously striving for recognition and legitimization of internal distress, his or her subconscious will be drawn towards those symptoms that will achieve those ends. Such a dynamic makes the official public naming of a disease such as anorexia nervosa a perilous event. So the basic concept, if I'm understanding Shorter and Ethan Waters correctly, is, everyone suffers. Everyone goes through problems and trials and afflictions and of every sort. And sometimes those internal conflicts, internal problems, in order to express them in a way that will gain recognition or uh, find a solution. It's basically, as I understand it, people want to be heard. They want to, especially when they're suffering or struggling, they're, even if they don't themselves know exactly how to express it, they're going to try to find the culturally approved way of doing so. So think of that in context of our world today. Uh, you know, there's all sorts of manifestations of um, what one author has called expressive individualism, but this pertains more to suffering and the way that a person will express his or her suffering uh, changes with the way that um, the societal approval of that, acknowledgement of suffering. So I thought it was a really interesting idea, and Waters expands on that. I'm trying to find where he mentions that at one point uh, in our in the United States, I think it was more like in other countries where resilience, fortitude, resilience, or courage, these kind of things were esteemed as they're valued in society, and that's one reason why Waters points out in many countries, when there's tragic events or cataclysmic events, earthquakes, floods, typhoons, pandemics, things like that. People in a lot of other countries, they deal with it in a way that's more resilient, by turning to God, by turning to family members, to friends, their community. Whereas sometimes in the United States, there's this reliance on the medical profession or psychiatry, um, because there's been a transformation away from resilience and courage towards elevating vulnerability as the be all and end all of a noble character. So, and it's not to say that vulnerability that it's necessarily wrong, because there's a lot of good things about being vulnerable or open and vulnerable, but somehow in the United States it seems like this, and I think psychiatry has been a part of it. There's also, I'm trying to remember the name of this lady. I read some of her books. Uh, oh, it's gonna escape my mind right now. But she writes all about vulnerability. I remember like a few years back, it was all the rage, that being vulnerable is the greatest thing. Um, but and that's maybe one reason why people expressing their pain through vulnerability has become a more, not only more accepted, but almost like a heroic thing. Like you will be praised if uh, there's all sorts of examples I could think of, but just even things like quote unquote coming out of the closet, or whatever you want to call it, these these acts of vulnerability, or being expressive individualism, are being, you could post this on social media and immediately get a response of thousands of likes, um, and it's, in some ways, I think this is a reflection of what Waters is talking about and what Shorter is talking about, that the way, because people suffer, people have problems, and they're either looking for solutions, or they want sympathy, they want empathy, they want people to be able to help them, and in order for their voice to be heard, they find ways that are specific to the culture to to express that suffering. If if I'm understanding Waters and Shorter correctly, and sorry to beat a dead horse, but I just think that's an interesting, very interesting observation, and it's relevant to our discussion of psychiatry under the influence, um, because that's a, one of the ways that the psychiatric labels work so effectively is because, yeah, people are looking for solutions and they're looking for help from their problems. So when they can find a label, and especially one that has the apparent medical authority behind it, that is a comforting feeling. You know, it's like, oh, why am I feeling this way? Oh, I'm feeling so down, or I'm feeling, man, I'm feeling, too excited recently, or whatever it may be. You find this specific label and you say, oh, that's what it is. It's in the DSM-5. It's listed as MDD, major depressive disorder. That's why. Oh, now I know this is a medical condition, and therefore I can express it to people, and now I can find help through psychiatry, through the mental health profession, and so forth and so on. I can find quote unquote medication, and I'll continue to talk in future videos about why that's problematic. Um, so, but getting back to the Ethan Waters Crazy Like Us, so his chapters, have to do with these different countries, and the American exportation of so-called mental illness, anorexia, PTSD, schizophrenia, depression, to all these different countries, and how the psychiatry and pharmaceutical companies had to figure out ways to market these supposed diseases to people, to societies where it didn't make any sense. Like Hong Kong, people in Hong Kong, they didn't care about anorexia. Like the girls weren't walking around worrying about how fat they were, or what they're, you know, trying to starve themselves to death. So what does psychiatry do? They had to figure out a way to tap into the culture of Hong Kong and market anorexia. And once that took root, then they had the product ready, whatever drug they were marketing. So same with PTSD. This chapter on PTSD in Sri Lanka is super interesting because I think Waters talks about the some sort of event like a flood or some sort of um, what do you call them, cataclysm, or trying to think of the word. Uh, Dang it, it's in the Proclamation of the World on the Family. The disintegration of the family will bring upon individuals, nations, and communities the calamities foretold by ancient and modern prophets. So calamity. So there's a calamity and a flood or something like that, and people are dying, people are suffering, but Americans are sending over these, psychology crews, these mental health crews to help these people in Sri Lanka. But what Ethan Waters points out is they don't need that. They don't even want it. These are people who are so resilient and so used to suffering that when these crews of people show up with all their Freudian theories, it's like, who ordered that? And it's actually creating a more adverse effect on people who are already hurt. I think this is also relevant to our pandemic. I don't like to call it COVID-19 because I'm a little bit skeptical of that title. I like to call it the Wuhan virus because that's where it came from. So this Wuhan virus, people are very scared about it, and rightly so. There's obviously a lot of things to be worried about. But I think, and I've already started to see articles crop up on the internet claiming, that there's this, together with this pandemic, there's going to be this rise in mental illness, depression, suicide, all these horrible things. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily not that it's wrong, but in some ways that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because in some of these countries, where floods and earthquakes are happening, the people bond together with their families, with their church, with their congregations, and they deal with suffering in a resilient manner. And all these American methods of dealing with suffering are actually proving to be more harmful than helpful. So that's a little bit about PTSD in Sri Lanka. I'd like to talk more about PTSD because Waters is rightly skeptical of the so-called diagnosis of PTSD, and he goes through the history, how that really started in Vietnam, and how that became a popular concept and way of dealing with the trauma that was inherent in that horrible war. Um, so yeah, anorexia in Hong Kong, PTSD in Sri Lanka, just some really fascinating ideas. Let's see if I have some other things from Waters to share with you. Um, I mean, I highly recommend. This was one of my favorite books to read because it's just very thought provoking. Um, let's see. Um, yeah, the Western concept of PTSD assumes the problem is. Oh yeah, this is a good point. So Waters shows that the Western concept of PTSD assumes that the problems and traumas are necessarily internal and part of a brain problem, or a brain, like broken brain, or you've probably heard these terms. But as Waters points out, it largely overlooks the most salient symptoms for Sri Lankan, those that exist not in the psychological but in the social realm. So the real disintegration is the family, is society, is institutions, things that bind people together. This societal disintegration, or family disintegration, relational disintegration, and as it's treated in other countries, is assumed sometimes from the West or the United States that it's automatically internal, or as Waters later, I think it's the last part of his book. Yeah, it's the last page actually. Quote, the Western mind, endlessly parsed by generations of philosophers, theorists, and researchers, has now been reduced to a batter of chemicals we carry around in the mixing bowl of our skulls. So, I mean, I think there's reasons for that reductionism, coming from scientism, and, a lot of things in modern philosophy, or that have produced this notion that a human being is nothing more than a conglomeration of cells and atoms, and just matter in motion. Um, so that's an insightful passage from Waters on that. Maybe just a few more things from this book. Uh, so Waters, he writes extensively about the American way of suffering, and how that differs from suffering in the way people express suffering in different countries. Um, let's see. Yeah. Oh, this is what I was saying earlier about vulnerability. And I'm still gonna forget that lady's name. I mean, I liked her book. It was like Courage to be Vulnerable, or something like that. I was like, uh, shoot, I'm gonna forget the name. It'll come to me when I'm not thinking of it. So Waters says, quote, in a momentous shift, contemporary Western culture now emphasizes not resilience, but vulnerability. And I think he's spot on about that. Um, but I think it'd be good to go back to, resilience as being not to the exclusion of vulnerability, but resilience is a good thing too. Let's see. I think the chapter on um, schizophrenia in Zanzibar. We'll have occasion to talk more about schizophrenia in future videos because Thomas Saz has a whole book um, called Schizophrenia: The Sacred Symbol of Psychiatry, and it's such a great book. Um, but I'll let you read that chapter in Waters' book, and I do want to mention chapter 4. It's called The Mega Marketing of Depression in Japan. So this is a really troubling chapter because what Waters shows is the the Eli Lilly, was it Eli Lilly? It might have been, or GlaxoSmithKline. Yeah, GlaxoSmithKline um, was seeking for a way to market their antidepressant. Um, I don't like the word antidepressant because it's a misnomer, but that pill, the drug Paxil, they were trying to find a way to market that in Japan, and what they found was, you know, Japanese people thought about suffering in a different way, and you couldn't just impose the American idea of depression upon these people. So this is directly from Waters, quote, "To make Paxil a hit in Japan, it would not be enough to corner the small market of those diagnosed with utsubyo," that's a Japanese word. The objective was to influence, at the most fundamental level, the Japanese understanding of sadness and depression. In short, they were learning how to market a disease. So how did they come to market a new disease in order to sell their drug in Japan? The way that they did it was see if I can find the passage. They found they found a way to tap into Japanese culture, um, and the way of thinking about depression. Let's see, where is it? It basically it had to do with something about having a like like a cold in your soul. So like your soul, it was like a soul sickness, that something in Japanese. I'm not finding it now, but basically GlaxoSmithKline um, began to tap into this particular Japanese concept uh, of suffering or depression, and then use that in their marketing. And after introducing this in their marketing, the sales of Paxil skyrocketed in Japan. Just like in other countries, sales of drugs skyrocketed once the notions of schizophrenia or bulimia or other more Western ways of thinking about suffering caught on. So that's a little bit about. Oh, here it is. Um, so, okay, quote: "The major problem GlaxoSmithKline faced was that Japanese psychiatrists and mental health professionals still translated the diagnosis of depression as utsubyo, and in the mind of many Japanese, that word retained its association with an incurable and inward depression of psychotic proportions. In hopes of softening the connotations of the word, the marketers hit upon a metaphor that proved remarkably effective. Depression, they repeated in advertising and promotional material, was kokoro nakaze, like a cold of the soul. It is not clear who first came up with the phrase. It is possible that it originated from Kenichiro Takiguchi's primetime special on depression. In that show, it was said that Americans took antidepressants the way other cultures took cold medicine. So that's one way that GlaxoSmithKline was able to market Paxil to the Japanese. See if there's any last things from got a lot of expletives that I've written in the margins of this book. Obviously the money and power was influential in all of these things. Uh, oh, here's an interesting passage at the conclusion of his book. Quote, cultures become particularly vulnerable to new beliefs about the mind and madness during times of social anxiety or discord. It is no surprise that the Western form of anorexia was able to worm its way into the unconscious minds of the young Hong Kong women in uneasy years between the Tiananmen Square massacre and the British handover of the province of China. Then he goes on to show like similar patterns in Sri Lanka, um, Zanzibar, Japan, and I would even say that now with the Wuhan coronavirus, that it's a particularly vulnerable time for a lot of people in a lot of countries, and it's going to influence the way people think about suffering. But it's also a way for psychiatry and what I might call mental health mongers to kind of weasel their way into the suffering that's already taking place under the pretext, and some of it is very well intended, like people want to help others, but some of it is under the pretext that people are suffering from this. They're going to be locked in their houses for too long. They're going to get depressed. They're going to get fat and lazy and sad, and then we're just going to need all these psychological resources. So it's a prime opportunity for psychiatry and the mental health industry to prey upon people who are already struggling. Um, so yeah, and like I said, there's obviously and also like Robert Whitaker said, there's a lot of good apples. There's a lot of good people that are in these fields that are trying to help others, and there are people that are they're doing good for in the best way that they know how. But I think there's also a tendency for busybodies to really increase. I think I've noticed in the internet the people talking about something called a Karen, Karen. Apparently, it's a popular internet term of someone who's excessively watching out for their neighbor in a kind of busybody fashion, instead of one of the original concepts of justice was just mind your business. Like if everyone just would mind their own business, people would be more resilient and probably things would get a lot better. Doesn't mean we shouldn't reach out to our neighbors and help others. It just means, like, for heaven's sake, like why add another layer of confusion upon an already confusing time? So I like that insight from Waters. And let's see. That's probably good for. I probably spent too long on this book, but I really like it, and I'd recommend it to anyone. Um, another author that Whitaker mentions frequently, and who also publishes frequently on the Mad in America website, is a man named Peter Breggin. Peter Breggin's a psychiatrist. Had a very prestigious training, and I want to say maybe Harvard Medical School, and really interesting background and story. And he's written numerous books, but his experience was that I think early on in his career he was assigned to work in a mental hospital or psychiatric facility of some sort, and he just started to find out like this is not what I thought it was. I thought psychiatry was about helping people and people struggling with mental illness. But what he discovered was, basically it was a very barbaric, prison-like scenario with people being tortured and drugged, and so he quickly found out that there are some major problems with the profession that he had chosen. Um, so I've read a couple books by Peter Breggin, and one of them is really interesting. Is called Medication Madness. So Medication Madness Um, it's subtitle: A Psychiatrist Exposes the Dangers of Mood-Altering Medications. At the time of the publication of this book, there were more than 200 million psychiatric drug prescriptions written annually. And Bregan says on the title, "Some do more harm than good." I would say they all harm. That was their intended purpose. It was to harm while actually pretending to help. So, and Bregan actually shows why that's the case, because I've had discussions with people about this, and it's a sensitive topic because when people are suffering, they want a solution. They want to put a label on their suffering, and they want some sort of remedy for their suffering. And so it's natural for people to turn to doctors or psychiatrists because people believe that they're authorities on these matters. So to have a pill and to have a label is a comfort to people. And also, many people have reported that that they do so much better, that the drugs save them. They were in, I'm not denying that people's experience, because people have all sorts of experiences. But what Peter Bregan points out early on in this book is that there's a reason why drugs do this, and it's not what people think. It's not necessarily that the drugs are saving them. There's something else going on. But this book is mainly, it has many stories, many interesting stories of people, good people, innocent people who were somehow, because of the drugs, actually ended up doing things they would never do in their their normal everyday life. He just, there's story after story, and Bregan has had a lot of experience with this in his practice, because he's also a psychotherapist, meaning he calls people in to do therapy and talk to them through the problems and things like that. And what he found was, there were these good people, maybe a mother who loves her children, who all of a sudden, after taking these drugs, is like strangling her kids. Y'all remember the story of, I think it was, her last name was Yates or something like that. Went and drowned a bunch of her kids. There's all sorts of stories we could think about in this context. Bregan doesn't necessarily mention all of these, but think of the Columbine massacre. Think of all these different school shootings or mass killings, or remember the guy, I think his name is Andrea Lubovitch, or the German Wings pilot who crashed a plane, killing like hundreds of people. There's all sorts of stories like this. Then you have other stories like people like Robin Williams, Prince, Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, even who's that beautiful blonde bombshell that Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe had some run-ins with psychiatry that actually, in my opinion, were primary causes in her demise. So you've got all sorts of stories like this, and like innocent people who, the mild-mannered father who, from one moment to the next, he's just living his life, and then the next day he's, out trying to kill a cop or something like that. Like, Bregan has all sorts of stories like this that show what these drugs are doing to people. But one of the concepts that I like to pull out of this book that I think is important is something that Peter Bregan calls medication spellbinding. So what is medication spellbinding? Peter Bregan says, quote, medication spellbinding describes how drugs mask or hide their harmful mental and emotional effects from the people who are taking them. Under the influence of drugs, many people feel better when in reality they are doing worse. Some become desperately depressed or violently aggressive without realizing that their medication is causing it. Every psychiatric drug impairs brain function and can, therefore, cause spellbinding. The cases in this book cover the entire spectrum of psychiatric drugs: antidepressants, stimulants, tranquilizers, antipsychotic drugs, and mood stabilizers. Um, he goes on to say, drug companies often conceal from the FDA, the medical profession, and the public the harmful psychological or emotional psychiatric reactions caused by their products. Misled by the FDA and the drug companies, most physicians who prescribe psychiatric drugs vastly underestimate the frequency and severity of medication-induced suicide, as well as other potentially life-destroying adverse effects, such as violence, mania, and psychosis, caused especially by antidepressants, stimulants, and tranquilizers. So, in essence, what's happening with these drugs, it's kind of like what you would think of anything. Like, you know, you if you're feeling bad and you go drink alcohol and you get drunk, yeah, you think you're doing better. You think you feel better for a moment because you're drowning your sorrows in booze or whatever it is. Same thing is going on with drugs. It's a little different, obviously, but well, one of the reasons is because people legitimately believe that these psychotropic drugs are medications. They believe they are medications that correct a chemical imbalance in the brain, but as we've shown earlier, it's simply not true. First of all, because there is no such thing as a chemical imbalance in the brain, except for if you want to call what the drugs actually create in the brain or cause in the brain by throwing the whole system out of whack. But the medical term for the medication spellbinding is intoxication anosognosia. Basically, when you're intoxicated and you don't know it, or so that's often what's happening when people are having all these symptoms of suffering, depression, or what some people interpret to be bipolar disorder, or so forth and so on. That they take these drugs and all of a sudden, and often family members observe, oh wow, look, he or she is, look at Susie's doing so much better now that she's on the drugs, or oh, look at my hyperactive kid, he's a vegetable now, things are great. So that's this concept of medication spellbinding is important because so many people believe that drugs are what save them, and it's not necessarily false, because in some cases, like, people who are desperate for solutions and they take these drugs and it puts them in medication spellbinding for a while, somehow they get through it, and then often they interpret their experience as being one of the drugs saving them, when it's much more likely that the drugs were actually damaging their brains in a way that sedated them or stimulated them, and they still managed to get through whatever period of suffering they were enduring. And I'd just like to clarify at this point, a reminder that the suffering is real. People suffer in all sorts of ways, and it's perfectly natural in a fallen moral world for people to struggle. And so it's also perfectly natural for struggling people to want to reach out to others, especially people who are perceived to be authority figures in medicine and psychiatry. And part of this video of Psychiatry Under the Influence is to show that's unfortunately the way that psychiatry works is by preying on people who are already suffering. So that's a little bit about Peter Bregin's book, Medication Madness, and I would recommend that if you want to read some really interesting stories about normal people who were changed into raving lunatics for a time because of the drugs that they were given. We're probably running out of time in this video, but I'd just like to introduce a few more books really quickly. Peter Breggin wrote a book called Toxic Psychiatry. And this is one of my favorite books ever written about psychiatry because Bregan goes into such depth and detail on all varieties of issues in psychiatry. Maybe I'll just highlight a couple of chapters. Let's see, psychiatry out of control, schizophrenic overwhelm, and neuroleptic drugs. Um, let's see, Haldol, Prolixin, Thorazine, Mellaril, antipsychotic drugs, miracle drugs, the plague of brain damage in medical history. Um, he gets into the theme of genetics, which is another interesting topic that maybe we'll talk about in future videos, because it's just not true that quote-unquote mental illness is a genetic disease. That's just simply false, and Bregan shows with a lot of precision and detail why that's the case. Let's see, depression, overwhelm, anxiety, women, children, the homeless, the psychopharmaceutical complex. So he has entire chapters on children and the terrible things. Oh, on shock treatment, electroshock. You know, so maybe I'll get more into this book later because it has so much great detail on the history of psychiatry, the abuses of psychiatry, and just the horrible things that the drugs are doing to people. Bregan was a friend of this lady that I actually met. Her name is Anne Blake Tracy. This is a book that I actually saw a long time ago, even before I discovered James Davies Cracked or Robert Whitaker or Peter Bregan. But I wish I would have picked it up at the time, but it just looked too fat. Didn't want to read the whole thing. But it's called Prozac, Panacea or Pandora. It's got a foreword by Peter Bregan because I talked to to Anne Blake Tracy, and she was friends with Peter Bregan, and I think they were both influential in the early crusade against the pharmaceutical companies in order to force them to retain their black box warning on their drugs, because what they found is a lot of these drugs are causing people to commit suicide and other self-harm, and Bregan and Anne Blake Tracy were part of some committee that was lobbying against the pharmaceutical companies, and that's the only reason why that drug companies now have to keep that black box warning on their drugs is because people like Anne Blake Tracy and Peter Bregan were fighting on behalf of all these victims of psychiatry. Another author that Robert Whitaker mentions and who also publishes frequently on Mad in America is a guy named Peter C. Gotcha. Probably not pronouncing his name correctly, but he wrote this book, Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime, how Big Pharma has corrupted healthcare. And basically this Gotcha goes even deeper into how these pharmaceutical companies, many of them are, they're more than just corrupt or, psychiatry under the influence. Like these guys are actual like mafia organized, organized crime, but they have disguised themselves as medicine, which is effective business model. If you can convince people that you're a doctor giving medicine, and when in actuality you're making people dependent on your drugs even to the point of death. Maybe you don't want to kill people because then they can't pay for more drugs. You just want to keep them on drugs as long as you can, so that more and more psychiatry will profit from that, and the pharmaceutical companies will profit from that as well. And Whitaker also mentions a guy named Irving Kirch. He wrote a book called The Emperor's New Drugs, Exploding the Antidepressant Myth. And this book has an excellent chapter called The Myth of the Chemical Imbalance. And I highly recommend that because Kirch goes into great detail about how the chemical imbalance myth was created, how it was marketed, and how the invention of this chemical imbalance myth, continues even today, despite the fact that it was disproven almost as soon as it came out, and despite the fact that there's still no evidence to support that there's any such thing as a chemical imbalance in the brain that causes any such thing as mental illness. So, great book, highly recommend it. So, that's a big stack of books on psychiatry and the truth about psychiatry. That brings us back again to Mr. Dr. Thomas Szasz, very interesting Hungarian dude who, very brilliant. The more I read of Szasz, the more I'm impressed with how well read he was for a psychiatrist. You often think of people who go to medical school and just not having much time to read anything else other than medical texts or whatever they read. But this guy was, very conversant in history, philosophy, literature, science, you name it. One of the reasons I enjoy reading him, even though I disagree with some of the things he has to say, is that he's just learned and well read, and he can pull insights from literature and philosophy and history. But I just want to maybe introduce this book because this book and the rest of Thomas Szasz's work is we could do hundreds if not thousands of videos on just his books. I mean we could do several videos on this book alone. But I just want to introduce you to this book at the end of this video, the fourth video in the series on the truth about psychiatry. So the beginning of this book, Thomas Szasz. Oh, I should just say in preface, who was this guy? Thomas Szasz. He's a Hungarian dude who came to the United States when he was a young man, and I've read a little biography of him. I should find that and maybe give a little more preface about his life at the beginning of the next video. But basically, he somehow got into medical school, decided to study psychiatry, even as a young man, in his teens, he understood that psychiatry was a sham. But he decided to go ahead and study and get all of his credentials, and then as soon as he had all his credentials, he started publishing these books to show that's from the inside. So kind of like Bregan, he's a psychiatrist, he's an insider. It's kind of like he just was able to show like psychiatry is bogus. So the beginning of this book, he says, my aim. He's talking about an essay that he wrote that was called the same title, The Myth of Mental Illness. My aim in this essay is to raise the question: is there such a thing as mental illness? And to argue that there is not. So, I mean, when I first read this, I thought, wow, this is a pretty bold statement. Here's someone coming along and saying, there's no such thing as mental illness. How can that be? Like, everyone knows there's mental illness, right? Look at all those people in, California on the streets, or, no, I know my friend, or I have a relative or a cousin, or I know someone who's mentally ill. That's impossible. But this is, trying to see, I think it was 1960 when Szasz wrote this article. He raised the question: is there such a thing as mental illness? And he is arguing that there is not. And in essence, I think Szasz is right. And as we go through these videos, I'll try to lay out more clearly why I think that's the case. And Saz points out that when he wrote the myth of mental illness, the notion that it's the responsibility of the federal government to provide health care to the American people had not yet entered the national consciousness. So think of that. I mean, even the concept that the government is supposed to take care of our health hadn't really, it's not intuitive. I mean, in my mind, it makes no sense at all. Like, people should take care of their own health, and yeah, families and friends and when necessary, doctors should help. But since when is it the government's responsibility to take care of a person's health? I guess I guess that's the case in what Saz calls what we live in now is the quote unquote therapeutic state. It's kind of like the nanny state that's just taking care of its little docile citizens. So another quick quote from the beginning of Saz's book. 50 years ago, the question, what is mental illness, was of interest to the general public as well as to philosophers, sociologists, and medical professionals. This is no longer the case. The question has been answered. Dismissed would be more accurate by the holders of political power. Representing the state, they decree that mental illness is a disease like any other. Political power and professional self-interest unite in turning a false belief into a lying fact. So I'll leave it with that at the beginning of the myth of mental illness, and we'll hopefully be able to get into that more next time in the next video, and really discuss what is this thing called mental illness. Is there such a thing? How do we know? And where did it come from? And I will, although Saz has received a lot of criticism, some justified, some not, I'm going to argue along with him that he's actually right about that mental illness is a myth, but that it's a powerful myth that, combined with the chemical imbalance hoax and the profitable pharmaceutical companies, has produced an epidemic, the epidemic that of which Robert Whitaker wrote. So let that suffice for today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please submit any questions or comments, and I'll post some links below, and I'll see you next time.